after the rain. That's yeah. Just kidding. Yeah, just kidding.
Good afternoon and welcome to the City of Muskegon Planning Commission meeting for September 26, 2024. This is a special meeting of the Planning Commission, and we'll begin with the roll call, maybe?
Just a second. Yeah.
1 second. She's
Well, let's-
grabbing.
All right.
First, and then adopt the definition second. Should probably do that.
Okay. Gotcha.
Take a 27 first?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, while we're waiting, we figure out who's here in a minute, but why don't we move on to the approval of the minutes for the meeting, which was a regular meeting of September 15, 2024.
I move to approve the minutes as presented from September 15th, 2024.
Support?
Support.
Support. Any discussion on the motion? All those in favor say aye.
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 Motion pass. Okay, Sarah, could you call the roll? We started without you.
Commissioners Johnson,
Here.
Gawron,
Here.
Willett Leroy, Pfeiffer,
Here.
Keener, Mazate,
Here.
Montgomery Keast, Blake,
Here.
Simmons,
Okay. Sarah, we approved the minutes of the meeting for September 15, 2024. There's a motion by Commissioner Seifert, supported by Commissioner Gowan to approve, and it was a unanimous voice vote.
September 12th.
Oh.
Oh.
So,
Okay.
okay.
Sorry, it says 15.
I would amend my motion to
It-
reflect the 12th.
Okay.
Yeah.
We're good.
And I would concur.
Thanks.
Do we need to revote?
No.
No, okay. Okay, let's move on to the public hearings, and we, staff has suggested we take the, item B first, case number 2024-27. Mike?
I'm sorry. Are you ready for case 27?
Yep.
Yeah. Well, before you do that, let me, I should back up and tell the audience how we're going to handle these hearings. We'll introduce, the staff will introduce the subject matter, give an opportunity for planning commissioners to ask questions, and then after that time, we'll open up to the public, both in person and in the viewing public, to make comments, and we'll close the public hearing, and we'll take action on the subject matter. Okay? All right, Mike.
All right. This is hearing case 2024-27, a staff-initiated request to amend section 2314 of the zoning ordinance to create a short-term rental ordinance. Last month, we discussed a little bit at the end of the meeting about how the city commission has asked us to work on this short-term rental ordinance for the city. Staff has decided to go with an overlay approach that's worked very well for us in other aspects of zoning throughout the city, and we believe this would be the best fit for this approach as well. What we did is then we noticed that there's a lot of complaints. Some complaints about the short-term rentals in the city and whether or not there's too many of them. We decided if there should be, try to decide if there's going to be a cap or not. We ultimately decided if there was going to be, there should be different for different parts of the city. We don't feel like there's too many of them over on the east side. We don't hear complaints coming from that, so we didn't want to limit the ability of property owners to be able to have that ability to do that on the east side of the city. So what we ultimately did was we looked at the census tracts throughout the city and decided to see how many housing units were in each census tract. That's an easy way to find that information. So we do have a separate table that we included in the packet that shows the 11 different zones We did not call them by the census tract zones. We ended up going with 1 through 11, just to make it a little more easier to follow. But they do follow the zones do follow the census tract zones. Each zone has an amount of housing units available, and we decided to show you what it would look like with a cap at 3% and at 4% of the housing units being allowed to have short-term rentals. Several studies have shown that at about 5% is when you start seeing negative impacts on a neighborhood. So we decided to show what it was at 3 and 4%. We ultimately made the numbers in the overlay district at 4%. So those numbers you see there reflect 4% of the city, or 4% of the housing units in each zone. We also made exemptions that properties in the Downtown Development Authority and the Lakeside Business Improvement Districts are exempt from the ordinance. So there would be no cap on the amount of short-term rentals that you could have within those two boundaries. We also made a caveat that a property may not have more than 2 short-term rentals abut its property lines, just so there's not too many around one particular property. And we did put in there that licenses would be allowed to be transferred. I did make a typo. We have it in here that the applicant would have up to 30 days to apply with the inspections department to transfer the short-term license. We do believe that should be 60 days. I just put that in there erroneously. I believe that covers pretty much everything in there if you have any questions.
Any questions for Mike? Mike, my question is, can you, I mean, maybe catch me up to speed a little bit about how we got to this point? From a city standpoint, I'm guessing there's, been some desire to regulate short-term rentals for some time, maybe based on some complaints and maybe some enforcement issues in the past. Is
Sure.
that accurate? And can you kind of catch me up?
Yeah, Jonathan may be able to speak a little bit more on that. I think he's been a little more involved.
Yeah, I'd be happy to elaborate on that. So in May of 23, we started a process of getting feedback from the public on short-term rentals. We held a open house at Muskegon High School in the auditorium, and had some discussions on what people were seeing, what we were seeing as far as whether enforcement goes, quality of life complaints, things of that nature. We also launched at that time for the entire summer season of 23 a portal on the website where people could report concerns and get information about short-term rentals. We determined in the fall of 23 that really what we were looking at was more of a quality of life issue, and then also some regulatory frameworks that needed to be put in place. So in the early spring, late winter of this year, the City Commission put into place new regulations regarding registration requirements, posting of rules on within rental homes, and things of that nature. The number of actual complaints that we've gotten from neighbors decreased with those regulatory components that we had put into place. However, there was still concern about how the number of short-term rentals in a neighborhood was impacting the feel of the neighborhoods themselves. And so we continued to have the discussion about what that would, what a good threshold would that be for the community. We looked at other communities to see how they've regulated it. The most common theme between all of the communities is that the communities that regulate short-term rentals do it as simply as possible. Unfortunately, because of the geography and the size of our community, simple caps or simple regulation wasn't as easy. So that's how we ended up evolving this into the zones through the census tracts that you have before you tonight. I should also mention that from March of this year through currently, there is a pause in place on new short-term rental registrations, and that was for a couple of reasons. We didn't want to exacerbate the problem as we were working to fix it, but also we kind of wanted to see how things would be impacted regarding property sales and things of that nature. And we have received anecdotal information from neighbors that they've noticed a difference in who's purchasing things where. So there's not a one size fits all component here. This is not an enforcement issue with police for the most part. This is really about a quality of life issue, and this was the staff's proposal on how to address that.
With respect to, I have two other questions or comments. With respect to the caps, to me that seems a little unusual in terms of from a zoning standpoint. Normally, you zone an area a certain way, and they can have however many they can have.
Sure.
And so, I'm not opposed to what the city is talking about. I mean, I live in a neighborhood that has the highest concentration of short-term rentals, but I'm just wondering from maybe a legal standpoint how this works from a cap standpoint.
Sure. The Michigan Supreme Court about a year ago ruled that short-term rentals are in and of themselves a commercial entity and not compatible with residential zoning. Therefore, cities have the right to cap and zone short-term rentals as they see fit, including up to banning. So in residential districts. So the Village of Spring Lake was the one who was sued on that. The Village of Spring Lake only allows short-term rentals in their DDA. And they disallow it in all other residential zoning districts. They were sued, and they were successful in the Michigan Supreme Court, demonstrating that they allow the short-term rentals within the village, just not within their residential areas. Okay. So we feel very comfortable that from a land use perspective, we are completely within our rights to be able to cap at whatever percentage or number we see. The city of Holland caps total number of short-term rentals outside of their DDA at 25 through the whole city. Okay. So this isn't a unusual thing. We were having those same questions as we started to go down this road, but that the Michigan Supreme Court ruling regarding the Village of Spring Lake is gives us a little more security in that regard.
So it's what you talked about was the quality of life issues, and that makes all kinds of sense to me. And you probably determine what is the root cause and how to determine that. But one thing that seems to me to be missing, and maybe there's not much you can do about it, but my limited experience is that one of the main problems with the short-term rentals is the numbers of people, the density in any particular unit. I just saw today online that there's a house that's being advertised in my old neighborhood to sleep 14. And it seems to me that those are the things that create the kind of difficulties in a neighborhood. And I used to see it downtown where we had large houses that were carved up. They didn't have enough parking spaces, and so you had you just had a large critical mass at a property that wasn't suited for that. And it seems to me that that's part of the problem here, but I don't see the ordinance really addressing that. Can you talk about that?
I wouldn't disagree that that's part of the problem. I think that is something that we can look at fixing with the regulatory handbook that we have through Safe Built and how those inspections work. That is another discussion point that we've had. It becomes a little bit more tricky on the enforcement side of things with, even if you get inspected, say it's a 4-bedroom house and so you can sleep 8, and presumably there's, 2 beds or 2 full-size beds per room, and then it gets advertised for 12. And if we're not necessarily made aware of it or things like that, how do you go through that process? So it's making sure that if we're putting those regulatory things into place, that we have the ability to police it correctly. Mm-hmm. So I think this, those little things will get tweaked over time. What we wanted to really do is get a tool in place that allowed us to control the growth that we've been seeing in the neighborhoods, and then as we need to on whether it's the regulatory handbook or if it means tweaking an ordinance down the road, doing that as opposed to not having the ordinance in place as a base. So.
Okay. Well, it seems to me that one of the positives that the city has done already is put regulations in place to deal with some of the concerns that have been raised by the neighbors.
Yep.
And you said that the complaints are down, there's
Yes.
more compliance apparently.
Yep.
So that's a real positive step, I think.
And I should note that a lot of those regulatory ideas, they came from short-term rental owners and neighbors in the community who worked together to come up with solutions to that. So that was a really nice thing to see.
It just seems to me, and it sounds like you're considering it, but it seems to me the density issue is maybe a root of some of the problems. Okay. Any other questions or comments? I thank you for
Yeah, no problem.
bringing me up to speed. So if there aren't any more,
I have a question.
yeah, go ahead.
Do you know why we chose to break it down by neighborhood instead of by overall by the city?
Yeah. So it's not actually by neighborhood; it's by census tract. They have kind of the similar names. But that's why we're going with the numbers as opposed to the names. But the reason we didn't do a cap citywide was if, like, say we said we could have 500 citywide. In theory, all of those could be in one neighborhood.
Oh, like Bluffton.
Yeah, and then you have a big concentration there, and then it takes away the opportunity for people in other parts of the city to do it, and then it concentrates everything in one neighborhood.
I got you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you.
Good
So
question.
this is the time for a public hearing. If anybody in the audience would like to address the planning commission, please raise your hand, and I'd ask you to come forward to the podium and state your name for the record, please. Yes, sir.
Good evening. My name is Scott Musselman. I think most of you know me. I've been before this planning commission before. I'm with Sam Products, the Mart Dock here in town. And just have a couple comments on the ordinance. If it's going to be done, I want to see it done right. One of the things you pointed out, Mr. Mazad, I would agree with. It should be addressed up front. The other one thing I'm going to point out is Zone 1 designates that 34 rental units will be allowed. The information presented to the City Commission in their last meeting indicated there are currently 73 rental units in Zone 1. So the day you enact this ordinance, you're going to have 39 rental units in violation of an ordinance. And there's nothing in here that addresses how that's going to be handled. Furthermore, you're suggesting that licenses be transferred upon the sale of a unit. Perhaps that should not be allowed in a zone where you're already exceeding the number of allowed units, and use that as a method to bring the number into compliance over time. Another thing I'd like to point out is there's no provision to address increases in the allowable number of short-term units as the number of housing units increase. As you're aware, we have a development proposed for 240 residential units. Windward Point proposes many more than that, and there's nothing in the language that would address how those developments might be able to use this ordinance to have short-term rentals. A couple of things that I think are worth thinking about before this is moved forward.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Musselman.
All right.
And I know that we're not necessarily in the business of responding, but Mr. Seifert, would you want to respond to this? Because I think
Sure.
that one issue with respect to, well, go ahead.
So yeah, so regarding the specifically Zone 1 and being over the cap, section overlay district section 3B specifically addresses that. Upon this adoption of the ordinance, all active short-term rental license holders in good standing with the city will be allowed to continue to operate their short-term rentals as long as they continue to renew their licenses. And that was just done from the standpoint of we wanted to make sure we weren't entering a taking situation where we had allowed something to exist previously and then changed the rules and made it not able to exist. So we put in there that those would carry forward. The other thing, and I know we've talked about this, but I'm scanning it really quick and I'm not seeing, but the the percentage numbers would be evaluated periodically as those census tract numbers change, and we would rerun those 4% numbers as new housing stock comes online. So that's why we say 4% and not a fixed number. And that fixed number that's in this ordinance is what the current housing stock is.
But there's not a provision in there for a reset?
So
Or-
it does go by the hard number, not the 4%.
Oh, it does? Okay.
Yes.
And
So
what? Say that again?
it goes by the hard number and not just the 4% because we don't know exactly what the housing stock is at until the new census numbers come out. So it would be upon the city commission or staff to reevaluate this every couple of years and see if enough housing has changed in a particular tract to warrant a new number.
But there's not a trigger.
There's no trigger.
Staff trigger. Yeah,
Yeah.
just staff triggered.
Just like
Okay.
any other ordinance, yeah.
That's okay. Anybody else like to address the planning commission? Go here. I'll recognize this gentleman.
I'm Dave Meddendorf. I live at 2314 Harrison, and I sell properties in Muskegon. One thing I'm wondering is, like, will you have like a waiting list? There's people that have been planning to make their house a short-term rental for a period of time, and they can they get on a list so in a year or two they could rent their house if they wanted to, and then if 30 houses are going to be unlicensed, sounds like an opportunity for me to sell a bunch of houses. But if 30 houses go on the market at once, might cause some values to decrease where they already went up. So something to think about. And one thing to solve like Mr. Musselman's problem in the development at the country club, maybe a new development, the developer would have the opportunity to talk to the city and say, in this new development of 60 homes, or John Rooks or whatever, we'd like to be able to have, this many here, and when they're developing the property, they could disclose that to the neighborhoods, and that might work for Mr. Musselman as well. Just, I guess, mostly comments. So.
Thank you. This ma'am over here. I didn't mention it, but as you approach the podium, please state your name and limit your comments to 3 minutes, please.
Hi, I'm Nina Leask. I'm in the Bluffton Beechwood neighborhood, and I thank you for all the work that you guys have done on the STRs, researching best practices for the future of Muskegon. So I want to ask you this: what do retail businesses, bars, and elevators have in common? They all require certification to be visible and available to the public. So I'd like to propose adoption of this proven practice and require that STR owners include the certification number in any advertising and contracts that they do, written or online. There's still 20% of STRs operating without certification. The house next door to us became an STR when it was sold. The Rockford owner advertised and actively operated for 6 months before they had their certification. The code clearly states in here that no person shall operate or conduct, maintain, manage, advertise, lease short-term rentals without a license. So it's clear in there. But the consequences of that violation are really not clear. On the topic of transfer of STR licenses when a property is sold, this is not a common practice. When the lawyer from Parmenter O'Toole came and presented at the February 2023 city policy meeting, he brought forward 6 local city ordinances. Out of those 6, only one of them offered a transfer, and to my knowledge, this city is now retracting that. Having a cap is a best practice, the 4%, based on showing that a community decays when they're at the 5%. My neighborhood, Bluffton Beechwood, is at the 17 to 20%. So think about that, means 1 out of every 4 and 5 is a short-term rental. So how can we ever receive this reduction if we offer every time something's sold, if we do not allow it to be reduced? This 12 to 15% also plays into our housing stock directly, that we know that's a long-term crisis. Yes, we're doing infill builds and ways to kind of increase the stock, but I want to bring a case in point to this, that how do we prevent them from becoming STRs? Take a look at 3220 Lakeshore Drive. It's a recent new build in the Bluffton neighborhood. This unit was as it was being built, 3 signs went on Lakeshore Drive saying VRBO and it had the reservation number right there. It wasn't even built, so how could it even have a license and advertise? So you as the city officials and myself, we believe neighborhoods are critical, right, to our community to thrive. And as such, the city did develop the neighborhood empowerment grants to our neighborhoods. This grant requires volunteers for dumpster day to get the money. Our dumpster day, twice a year, not one of them is an STR person. And I just want to say, volunteers don't come from the STR community. I leave you with this final question. How many STR owners in my Bluffton neighborhood actually live in the city of Muskegon? The number is 83. 83% do not live in our city. So why are we putting something through for people who do not live in our city? Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? Yes, sir, in the back.
Hi, my name's Jack Page in Bluffton Beechwood neighborhood. The city and staff have really done great work in the last 2 years crafting an STR ordinance, and I think it was crafted pretty fairly. Came up with a fair cap of 4%, allowed current owners to still continue to operate at, so we weren't kicking anybody out, anything like that. And I think it was a fair and even ordinance drafted up until we put a transferability clause in. And that basically takes the teeth out of most of this ordinance, at least in my opinion, because you're not going to see the level of attrition drop down with that transferability. Currently on my block, there's 4 STRs alone, with 2 more gearing up in the bullpen because they were already ushered in before the moratorium. 2 directly abut my property now. So now I'm going to see, with the transferability clause put in, I'm not going to see any attrition or any relief probably in my lifetime. We've worked for a couple of years on this ordinance, and I think that adding in that transferability clause in the last 30 days after 2 years worth of work is a mistake, and I don't think we'll see any relief if it remains. So, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Page. Yes, ma'am.
My name's Nancy Holka, and I'm also from the Beechwood Bluffton neighborhood. I've been writing emails and coming to these commission meetings since 2018 about these issues, and I have made point after point about the problems with short-term rentals and what it's like to live next one, and how it just impacts your life and the stress of living next to a short-term rental. Have you looked at your mission statement? It's hanging out there if you need to go look at it. It says maintain and enhance the neighborhoods of the city. I know you're working on something that's trying to be fair to everybody, but if we do this transfer on ownership, we are not maintaining and enhancing the neighborhoods of the city. I will never have the hope of getting rid of the one next to me. I've been coming here for 6 years trying to keep my hope alive that something could happen, at some point it's going to be sold and I'll get some nice neighbors moving in there. But no, now you're taking away this hope, and if it gets sold, it's just going to continue to be a short-term rental because that property obviously is going to be very valuable as that business there. It's going to increase that property and decrease my property value because people are going to look and they're probably going to say, I don't want to live next to a short-term rental. So by doing this, you're decreasing my property value. And when I bought my house in this R1 neighborhood, the zoning at that time specifically said no hotels, motels, tourist homes. Tourist home is an old-fashioned term for short-term rentals. So I should have never had the short-term rental next to me in the first place. I love my neighborhood. I have the most wonderful neighbors. I love Muskegon. I grew up here. I graduated from here. I don't want to have to move because I'm going to be sentenced to having the short-term rental next to me forever. So please, please seriously look at that. That should not be transferable upon ownership. Also, please look at these numbers. When you look at Harbor Town and Bluffton Bay and the new development at the golf course, none of those are allowing short-term rentals. So if you backed those out, Bluffton Beechwood would be even higher on their percentage of short-term rentals. It seems like the only way we can get away from living next to one is if we move into an association. And not all of us want or are able to do that to pay those fees. So please also consider that issue as well. So I know the city has put some time into this, and I thank you, but please look at this transfer on ownership thing. That just is not fair to those of us who live in this neighborhood, in this community, and want to stay here. And you've taken away our hope of it ever going away. So thanks for listening to me.
Thank you. Anyone else? Nobody? Okay, now we'll go to the viewing audience. If you would like to address this subject with the Planning Commission, please call area code 231-724-6721. And you have an opportunity to speak to the Planning Commission regarding this issue. Pardon me?
He'd like to still speak.
Oh, yeah, you can speak to this issue. And no calls yet, yeah. Please state your name and limit your comments to 3 minutes, please.
Sure. My name's Ed Bodman. I live in the Bluffton neighborhood and short-term rental owner there. The reason for the short-term rental transferability was that some of us have a house that's on a hill that was bought specifically as a short-term rental. You're on a busy street. Have one that we winterize. It's only open in the summer for 3 or 4 months. There's a church down there. There's a firehouse on Lakeside. We have properties that are seasonal cottages that were intentionally seasonal cottages and purchased as short-term rentals. So if they wouldn't be transferable, the value of how they were originally purchased would be greatly deteriorated. And I think that was the reason behind some of the conversations behind that. And I guess lastly I'll say is that historically in the last 5 years in the Bluffton Beechwood neighborhood, there have been an average of about 20 properties sold. So everything that's been done is really relegated to managing that part of our community, and that's 20 properties a year that are actually change hands. So that's not very many as it relates to the entire city, and that's what this ordinance proposes, is just regulating that part. So thanks for your time.
Thank you. Any comments from the audience? So we'll take. So I'll take a motion to close the public hearing.
I say the person who walked in, if you want to ask him if he wants to speak.
Did you want to speak, sir?
Yeah, I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, you're too late.
You're about to be too late, so.
Welcome. Come to the podium and state your name for the record, please.
My name is Verton Contry, and I live at 1167 Peck Street. And we have a 4-unit property over in, I guess it'd be the NIMS neighborhood, Lakeshore Drive. You know, we respect that people want to restrict those number of properties that are doing short-term rentals, but you know, a 4-unit is slightly different than a single-family home. It's not really displacing a buyer. It's not really displacing a person who wants to rent the full single-family home, because it's 4 apartments, small apartments. 2 of them are studios, one's a 1-bedroom, and the larger one is downstairs. And you know, I don't want to lose the ability to be able to, you know, I do like nurses and insurance stays that stay 30 days or longer, but during the summertime, you know, the downstairs unit used to be as an Airbnb, and so we'd like the opportunity to be able to continue to do that on a multi-unit property. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you. So now I'll take a motion to close the public hearing.
So moved.
Support.
Motion and support to close the public hearing. Any discussion on that motion? All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, same sign. Motion carried. And now, Mike, you're looking for us to make a recommendation to the city commission, right?
Yes, and I'd like to remind that staff's recommending the 60-day transfer, not the 30 days as written. So
Say that again.
staff's recommending that there be 60 days to transfer, not 30 as proposed.
Right.
So you may want to make that a condition.
So you're saying that the applicant or the owner of a STR the new owner has up to 60 days to apply
Correct.
with the inspections department.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay. Got it. Understand it. So I'll entertain a motion on this subject. Do we need,
I-
if we're not ready for a motion, do we need to have some more discussion?
Well, that's what I was wondering.
yeah.
Should we discuss
Yeah,
before? Or
absolutely.
would you welcome discussion
Absolutely.
before making the motion? Okay. I do have a question for you, and then some thoughts. The question is with regard to, so you did add what's on screen here, not in the packet, but on the screen here, is with regard to exemptions. So it's item 1, overlay district, subsection C, exemptions. Properties located within the Downtown Development Authority and Lakeside Business Improvement District boundaries are exempt from this ordinance. And there are no maximum number of short-term rentals allowed within these areas. And so I just wanted to get a couple points of clarification. One, by it saying that it's exempt from this ordinance, are we intending it to be exempt from the entirety of the ordinance, or were we only intending for that to be exempt from the cap connected to the overlay districts?
That it would be the caps. They would still have to register.
Okay, so should we word that as saying are exempt from this section of the ordinance, or exempt from the?
You just say exempt from the cap.
The
Yeah, I
overlay,
think that's probably a better. Yeah.
the overlay district, or I just don't
From
want
the
inadvertently exempting them from the ordinance altogether.
I would say that it should say from the caps mentioned in Part B, 1B.
Okay. From the cap mentioned.
And I guess to dovetail on what the mayor said, with respect to the Lakeside and the Downtown Business Authority, we're pulling those numbers out, right, of the district. So they don't count towards whatever it is. If they're part of Lakeside, for example, Lakeside neighborhood, the number that you come up with for Lakeside is exclusive of the business district.
Correct.
Okay.
Yes.
And these numbers here reflect that. So the numbers that are shown here, for instance, Zone 2, that reflects already having taken out the Lakeside Business Improvement District, that 68 number. That's not inclusive of the...
There would be 68 allowed outside of the bid.
Yeah, and I think
Okay, I just wanted to make sure that is...
Yes.
Okay.
So if there's 20 inside the bid now, which I think it fluctuates around there, you're still allowed 68 outside of that.
I was going to say for illustrative purposes, when we first discussed this in the work session, we had not, or sorry, I guess it wasn't the work session, it was legislative policy. We hadn't exempted the DDA and the Lakeside bid, and in that first version, with the Lakeside bid inclusive of Zone 2, Zone 2 is also capped out. When we remove the Lakeside bid and remove those STRs within the Lakeside bid district, it freed up licenses within Zone 2.
Okay. Looks like it would allow another 7,
Yes.
potentially.
Yeah.
With regard to that same section with regard to exemptions, should we, in lieu of the Lakeside Business Improvement District, I know we've talked about that, and so I appreciate this being reflected here because we were intentional in looking at exempting the DDA and the Lakeside bid, in part to encourage SDRs to go there, which are dedicated commercial areas. In lieu of referencing Lakeside Business Improvement District, I'm wondering though if we should say Lakeside Corridor Improvement Authority, because the bid is likely to fall off in the next couple years. The Lakeside Corridor Improvement Authority is expected to continue in perpetuity, similar to our DDA.
Maybe we could mention both.
Okay.
I mean,
you want to put? I'm okay with slash.
Well, I think
Lakeside Business Improvement District / Corridor Improvement Authority boundaries.
I mean, the most appropriate thing to do would be wait until that changes, I believe. Because
Well,
it may
the
never
CIA
change.
exists now. That's what I was just saying.
Yeah.
The CIA exists now. The bid exists now. But the expectation was the bid was going to be dropped off. Give the CIA time to do what it needs to do in terms of growing the incremental tax base, and then
Yeah.
the bid would drop off.
I suppose we should list them both.
And they have the same boundaries?
Yes. I
Okay.
believe so, yeah.
Okay. And then with regard to the 30-day versus 60 days, I know you mentioned there was a typo and the intent was to go 60 days. Personally, if we're going to have that in there, I would prefer 30 days to 60 days from the date of closing, which, in my opinion, is ample time for a new buyer to apply, get their application in. It doesn't say they have to be licensed in 30 days, but they have to have applied within that window. And I'd prefer a shorter window than 60 days. I think 30 days is more than enough time, in my opinion. So I guess this is the question that I'm wondering how my fellow planning commissioners feel, if they, prefer 60 days, if they like 30 days, if they're indifferent on the window.
I'm indifferent to that. I think the whole issue of the transferability is the elephant in the room, and maybe that requires some more discussion. I mean, if that's going to occur, then to me, whether it's 30 or 60 days doesn't matter a whole lot.
Mr. Chair.
I mean, I would not object to the 30 days, to reduce it to 30 days, if the transferability stays in the ordinance. Mm-hmm. Yes, sir.
But Mr. Chair, you're really right. The transferability is the elephant in the room, and we've heard from some of our neighbors, rather compelling concerns as to, what, transferability, could potentially mean for an area. Bringing up the concern about, what happens down the line where you don't see attrition to an area that is already overrepresented, even by the 4% or the actual housing count or whatnot. And I really think that transferability, is a concern, and attempting to wrap my head around what that can or does mean in one setting, it does concern, it is a concern of mine, especially after hearing, from our neighbors, and really to get, attempting to give it due consideration.
I think that's a good point, and I think there's a number of issues here that maybe could be tweaked a bit. Whether it's 30 days or 60 days. Mr. Musselman made the point of the reset. I think I'd feel more comfortable if there was something that said, however many years or whatever, upon census change or whatever, that there's a reset. But I guess I'm not hung up on that. I would like it to be less likely or less subject to subjectivity, I guess. Mayor.
In that regard, if we did an automatic reset, I'm more concerned with the implications of that than the transferability piece. I understand the concerns about having that transferability option such that it could extend, the number, in a census tract that already exceeds the cap, that it could extend that and be a longer time period before it gets back down below that cap. The concern that I have with the automatic extension or the automatic updates to that is, particularly if you look at census tract or zone 1, because we have Sappy and Windward Point within that zone. Right now there's no housing there, but there is a contemplation, there's a PUD with the expectation of over 2,000 new housing units going in there. When you add in sand docks, you're looking at another 250-ish. So between those, you're looking at almost 100 or about 100 new short-term rentals that would be allowed within Zone 1, which is essentially Beechwood Bluffton neighborhood. So more than doubling what's allowed now. And so I am more concerned about that implication of dramatically increasing the number of short-term rentals that would be allowed in Beechwood Bluffton versus the transferability issue. So I'm comfortable with not having an automatic reset and us taking it, being able to evaluate from time to time, because then at that time we can say, hey, it is sensible. And I'll say this: I actually prefer to take PUDs out of the equation in terms of not having PUDs be factored into the formulas for each of these zones, and they be treated separately. They could still have their own 4% cap, so it's not like they're being excluded from this opportunity, but that those numbers within a PUD don't apply to the census tract. So we don't get it skewed, because if a PUD is going to be, HOA, not allow any short-term rentals, and it raises the number of short-term rentals for the census tract, it allows for a greater concentration of the short-term rentals in the pre-existing neighborhoods.
But all
So that's the
PUDs
concern.
wouldn't be HOAs.
No, you're true. That's true. But I'm saying a lot of PUDs tend to have HOAs or restrictions on that. So if we treated them, and they're uniquely siloed, they'd still have 4%, still have that opportunity, but wouldn't go into the formula for the neighborhoods. In lieu of that, though,
But then,
I would prefer us to actually start at a lower cap of 3% than 4%, because rather start lower with the opportunity to go higher if need be or warranted in the future, and give us the time perhaps to look at how we can better handle situations like a major development like Windward Point, how that interplays with this ordinance and the Beechwood Bluffton neighborhood. With 3%, because if you start at a higher number, you can't really put it back. They essentially become legacy properties, and so which is what we're dealing with right now, and the issue of transferability, because like it or not, and unfortunate, this is a problem of our own making as a city, where we allowed these without any kind of restrictions or limitations in the neighborhoods, and we saw a higher number appear in certain areas of our city, particularly in Beechwood Bluffton. And so I do definitely understand the concerns, and I think the legitimate concerns from our residents with regard to transferability perpetuating the higher concentration of short-term rentals. At the same time, I do recognize that the city enabled that. Our city ordinance allowed that. And folks invested in good faith based upon that. They put considerable money into properties to be used for the purpose of short-term rentals. And for us to disregard that gives me pause, and almost feels like a taking.
So if you go to the 3%, then it really makes Zone 1 even more underwater in terms of the numbers, and it puts Zone 2 underwater in the negative as well. And part of the concerns I've heard is the unlikelihood that many of these units would ever go back to something other than SCRs. And I guess I'm just concerned that going to even a smaller percentage makes it worse, not better. And I guess in terms of the carving out large-scale developments that may occur, I understand what you're saying, and I think it has merit, but I'm not sure that is a good thing. And why would you do it? Because I think those developments or those properties are part of a neighborhood, and so why would you carve those out necessarily?
You want me to answer?
Yeah. Well, yeah. If you'd like to.
In the regard that, like, if you look at Harbor Town right now, short-term rentals are not allowed, and so if you factor in Harbor Town development in the formula for Zone 1 census tract, even though none of them are allowed in Harbor Town, but that percentage can be applied to the rest of the neighborhood. So you're just artificially increasing the number of units that would be allowed in the Old Town Bluffton or in Beechwood neighborhood. And so that's the concern about them being factored in. That's why I'm like, we can't figure out a way to take out the PUDs and have them be, siloed. They still can have SDRs, as they like, they still would have the same 4% and just would not be factored into the rest of the census tract. And if we can't do that, that's why I'm suggesting us look at perhaps doing a 3% number.
But that overall, that increase, if that occurs, if it, within a large scale PUD you have some STRs, then that increases the number that is in that neighborhood from an overall standpoint. Is that a good thing? I mean, to me, it's almost a way of saying of getting around this ordinance.
How so?
Well, because you have a certain number right now in Beechwood Bluffton, for example. There are not going to be any additional STRs allowed, whether it's 3% or 4%, right? Mm-hmm. But if we allow it under within a PUD that is in that neighborhood, then they get additional STRs that wouldn't otherwise not be available.
In that unique situation, you would be able to see them in the PUD, yes, and that would create an aggregate for the pre-separating. But conversely, if they're not allowed there, but that number is included in the overarching, then you're going to see a higher number of short-term rentals in the traditional neighborhoods.
Well, throughout the overall neighborhood, whether it's within that PUD or somewhere else, but it's going to take a large number for the Beechwood Bluffton. It's going to take a large number of additional units to get over that 4% cap, and certainly 3%.
Or I wonder if there's an opportunity.
And that's not bad. I'm not saying it's a bad thing.
Mm-hmm. I wonder if there's an opportunity to remove the PUDs and have them be handled on a case-by-case basis as we're approving the PUDs.
Yeah. I'm just not comfortable with the predatory versus fairness. It seemed like we on a thin line with that. And then I had a question too about the developers. Developers versus buyers. We don't have any requirements about their sponsorship and responsibility to what they're giving back into the community is kind of like vague. The residents kind of have a dog in the fight with developers coming in. It seems like they kind of get a free pass almost with hearing you guys speak, but just some questions I had, or statements I had.
I think that I agree with you with respect to a PUD. If we allow that to be carved out, then unless we put some kind of cap, I guess we're talking maybe a 3 or 4% cap, they would automatically get that. Whereas right now, if you're in the lakeside, well, particularly the Beechwood Bluffton area, it wouldn't be allowed. There are not any additional STRs available. And and I think the other thing about a PUD is, I don't think we can assume that, whatever kind of PUD is going to have an HOA and going to have the same kinds of restrictions that certain condominium associations have. They're not all like that. And I don't know that we have a development right now that's underway near the golf course, and I don't know what. They might have a HOA, but who knows what those restrictions are. There's an HOA in Bluffton Bay Estates. I mean, just because it's an HOA doesn't necessarily mean that they have the kinds of restrictions with respect to SCRs. Mr. Seifert.
So, one of the things I said when I was giving the overview of the proposal was staff has found that the regulations that have been successful have been simple. And one of the reasons the staff chose the census tracts and not our neighborhoods or other geographical boundaries is because this is a boundary that's set by the federal government, not by us. And it's very clear on what the housing unit number is based on the census. Staff's concern was if we started to carve out PUDs or HOAs, that number then becomes subject to interpretation to a certain extent. And it opens ourselves up for a little bit of, are we counting the numbers correctly? Additionally, the staff's other concern was that if we were looking at HOAs, we were then putting the staff in a situation where we have to regularly follow up with HOAs to determine if they've changed their bylaws to allow for short-term rentals or not. So then if Harbortown, for example, then allows short-term rentals, and I'm not sure how many units are in there, is that enough to shift the number of short-term rentals in Beechwood Bluffton? And then if they go and change it back and say that you're not allowed to have it, then we have to go back and adjust that number again. And so then we start moving away from the simple, straightforward definitions of what we're looking at. And I don't think that there's going to be a perfect solution to it. And staff spent a lot of time, hundreds of hours debating, what's the right way to do this, looking at other communities, and talking to other zoning administrators, planning directors, city managers, police chiefs, seeing how they handle these things, and really the most straightforward option was the best one, and that's what we're presenting here.
Can you tell me or us how you landed on the transferability issue? It sounds to me, and I don't have all the history of this process, but it sounds like maybe the ordinance or the original draft did not include transferability, and now it does, obviously. If that's true, what changed?
So we had the discussion with the commission, and there was some feedback from commissioners, city commissioners, that there was a appetite for transferability for a couple reasons, including ones that Mr. Bogman had brought up about unique properties, that if there wasn't the transferability to that they wouldn't necessarily be sellable as family homes, either because of size or location, geography, things of that nature. And so we started to hear feedback from the city commissioners that there was an appetite on the city commission to allow for that. And I don't think staff had a strong opinion one way or the other on that. But
we're talking about a small number of those.
To be honest, I don't have a number. I don't have that number.
And I'm sorry. I don't
want no, you're good. I was gonna say that the grandfathering in was something that staff felt strongly about allowing that to maintain. And there was discussion about, then through property sales it would attrition. But then the argument was brought up about those unique properties, then how do you start to carve that out? And so that's how the transferability came in.
So those unique properties, given, if we're talking about Beechwood Bluffton, for example, and there's probably other areas as well. My guess is those unique properties at one point were single-family homes, probably. So they're unique now, but are they really unique? And were they probably single-family homes at one point that now are not?
Some were cottages, are my understanding, that were never year-round residences, in which, in Bluffton in particular, a lot of those homes were summer homes from the beginning. It was the artist colony. There are a number that were year-round, but there was a large number that were seasonal. So there's some that were still seasonal. I know there's one that was a church. There's one in Lakeside. I'm forgetting the cross streets right now. That was one of our old fire stations. That was turned into a short-term rental.
But there was a single-family home for many years.
Okay, yeah. So, but
I'm sorry.
Yeah. No, you're fine. It's so there. That was the argument, and then from hearing from city commissioners on those discussions, that helped to work that into the ordinance.
I guess as we kind of make sausage here, trying to put this together, I guess I'm less interested in the transferability issue because I understand that there may be some anomalies here, but I just wonder if they're small in numbers, and are we trying to deal with an issue for a small number of properties at the hindrance of the rest, I guess. I'm not certain about that, but that's a concern I have. But I want to hear from the mayor more.
Well, on the point in terms of transferability, and the concern is particularly one census tract who exceeds the cap presently. Whether we go with a 4% cap or go with a 3% cap, they exceed that cap. They could not exceed the cap if these new developments come online and the formula is updated, then now they can have more. But currently they'd exceed the cap. And so the question and desire is, how do you get that below that cap? And so without transferability, there's an expectation that it could happen sooner. With transferability, it still will happen. It just won't happen the pace won't be as quick. And the reason why I say it still will happen is because you'll have natural attrition still. There will be short-term rental operators who choose to discontinue those operations. I know of properties that has already happened. That they're like, we're done with short-term rentals, we're not doing it anymore, and they exit the industry. So there's that aspect of it. The other aspect of it is through problematic STR operators. We updated and adopted new policy this past spring that has a 3 strikes and you're out rule. And so if you've got a problematic property and the STR owner is not being responsive, is not curing the defaults, and you see a pattern of ordinance violations, then the city is in a position to revoke their permits. And so that's one other way that we can see natural attrition over time. And then finally is that window, after closing. Someone's buying a property and they are not do not act promptly enough within that window to apply for a new permit, then they will lose their permit, and that will factor into attrition as well. So it's a matter of pace.
Is that likely to happen? I mean, if someone's buying it for an STR because that's the value, right? I mean, that's what creates the value of the property is the STR. I would think that it'd be very rare that somebody would not take the steps to transfer the property. And the other thing,
I would say that's probably true. I do know of a case where somebody bought a property, didn't do their due diligence, and they bought a property this year, wanting to be a short-term rental, then realizing, hey, there's a pause, I can't do that. Looking at these limitations, and that house went back on the market. And so there are, circumstances like that. So I agree, it's probably not going to be too common, but that is one other valve or one other avenue that I could see some attrition happening.
And if there is a problem owner, you mentioned the 3 strikes and you're out. I mean, if somebody's having some difficulty, there's ways to transfer the ownership of the property and still maintain it. If there is the transferability, they can just transfer the ownership.
I wouldn't think, staff can weigh in that, but I wouldn't think that if you have an identified history of problems and that would trigger the revocation, that they could quickly sell the property to somebody else and transfer it, and it wouldn't be revoked.
Yeah, I'm saying before the 3rd strike. My understanding.
Oh, like after the 2nd strike.
You can transfer it to my spouse. And I just think there's saying, and I'm not saying the city should try to try to close every loophole. I think it's, some things are extraneous, and probably not likely to happen. So where we are is we need to consider action on this subject, whether we're going to move forward and make a recommendation to the city commission, and if so, what that looks like.
One question.
Yeah.
It's back with the PUDs. This is for staff, planning manager. If we were to take PUDs out of the census tracts in terms of the formula, can those be handled on a case-by-case basis in terms of the number of short-term rentals allowed? Rather than saying 4% across the board, even for PUDs. The reason I'm wondering about that is because there are some PUDs that are purposely for STRs. We saw one already in Lakeside. That's kind of a moot point because it would be within the Lakeside Business Improvement District. It wouldn't fall into the cap. But there was talk, a few years ago, and I saw plans, and at some point there was expectation they'd be bringing forward a PUD amendment for the country club. There was a plan for short-term rental operations there, and they wanted to have short-term rentals on the golf course at the country club site. So they had the long-term properties, houses that they developed for sale, but then they were also looking at short-term ones, both of which intending to help ensure the long-term sustainability and viability of the country club. And so under the current version, they would be precluded, essentially precluded, from moving forward with that short-term rental development on the golf course, which I would think that we wouldn't necessarily object to. I mean, and it's not, in the middle of neighborhoods, so you're taking out that issue. And if it's tucked away, I wouldn't think that we would necessarily object to that. So that's why I'm wondering, like, could we just handle PUDs separately on a case-by-case basis as they come forward with short-term rentals?
We could, and it would make a lot of sense for that particular one. I don't think anybody would really object to it. It's not around a neighborhood, but that would also open up the door for Harbortown to say, we'd like to start doing short-term rentals. We're more in the middle of a neighborhood than they are, so I think that would not necessarily be as fair to do it that way.
But that would be at the discretion of the Planning and City Commission.
Yes.
Then.
Chair.
But go ahead.
I take Mr. Seifert's point with when you see where these regulations, have been developed. It's the simplicity, is probably the best, and you have a reasonable level of certainty of the number of houses and what you're actually dealing with and what a cap means, because it's within a census tracking. A lot of work has gone into this. I think there's a lot of unintended consequences when we start dealing with carve-outs. It's only speculation what it may or may not mean. There's a relative level of certainty, because right now we don't know what those empty pieces of property are going to provide or not, and how soon. Right now, we're looking at how do we regulate the realities of today, given the number of residences. What is the census within these zones? My question, my concern has really focused on transferability, not our caps and numbers. We know what those are, but looking for some level of some level of knowledge, some level of what does this mean, when it comes to transferability, and I don't know what that probably means. I know you've had the larger discussions at the staff and city commission level, but that continues to be a concern. But as far as carve outs, anything else, I take Mr. Seifert's admonition that simpler is better. My only concern at this point, focused on the transferability thing, as brought forth by some of our neighbors here, and trying to find a relative level of comfort with that.
Mr. Seifert, do you know, I don't mean, I didn't mean it to come out that way. With respect to the STRs that are in place, that have been licensed over time, do we have any sense how many of those over time, I guess, since the city's been regulating, how many of those have transferred? Does that occur a lot? Do you, maybe Mike or is that because that's the value, right? I mean, these most of these were houses at one time. They were single family houses, and somebody either sold it or bought it to be a STR, or they developed it into an STR, and then maybe they sold it, and that created the value that I think some people are talking about. Does that occur a lot? And
I don't have the number off the top of my head. I do know that it does occur from time to time, but I also do know that we've had short-term rentals that have sold and become single-family homes again. but I also don't know how often short-term rental properties go up for sale. We could probably go back and it would probably take a little bit of digging, but I think we could go back and look.
Okay.
Yeah,
What-
but I don't have that number on the top of my
Okay.
head.
Where I'm going with this is, you know, you have a house that has a certain value, and then because it's a short-term rental, the value increases because of the income that it can generate. Now, that house is worth X versus Y. And I think that's part of the concern, I'm sure, that we're hearing from current SCR owners, that if they can't transfer the license, then it hurts the resale value.
In that, so the resale value or the investment into the property were things that we did discuss on the staff level. A point that was made at one point in time was that certain things were in certain short-term rental situations, things are done to the property that maybe would not be done if it was a long-term rental a owner-occupied property.
Right.
And so there's certain levels of investment and things like that, and how does that what risk is there related to the investment at that point in time? The other side of that coin that staff had the conversation on was, are we introducing another factor into the valuation of the property that is artificially inflating some property values in the market, but that would impact all the properties in that area, not just the short-term rentals, because when you do assessments and you go through and look at how that's done through assessing, you're looking at the properties across the board, not just the ones that have recently sold.
Right.
So it would have an impact across that census tract. But we did discuss that as a concern, thought, factor, however you want to say it, related to transferability. So
one other concern I'd have about carving out pieces of property in a neighborhood is, it seems to me that anybody could take a tract of land and make it a PUD and then designate all of those homes that they build in that area as STRs, and then there wouldn't be any cap or regulation. There might be a cap, as you said, Mayor, that we would impose, but there would be likely an ability to have STRs in that PUD that might not otherwise exist.
Well, anyone would have the opportunity to apply for a PUD, but not everybody would automatically get that PUD with a higher SDR number or unlimited SDR, because that ultimately comes to the Planning Commission and the City Commission for adoption. And so if there was a reason to not have that or to differ, that could be included in what's adopted by the PUD. So it isn't necessarily used by right that they would be able to say, here's my PUD, and
Right.
But so I'm not so I do think we need to take those into account, but the way that this is presented here, I'm not so worried about the PUD piece, because there are finite numbers in here. It's not a percentage, and it doesn't trigger automatic resets. But this needs to be on a radar as we move forward. Like when we're looking at future resets, when we're looking at adjusting those numbers, because if when Point comes online, you got 2,000 more housing units on there. That's dramatically pushing up the number of STRs that would be allowed in Zone 1, and we need to be conscientious of that, in my opinion.
Right.
Particularly if that development's not going to have short-term rentals there, and then it creates opportunity for a lot more short-term rentals in the pre-existing neighborhoods.
Well, it would appear to me that most new developments in Zone 1 would not be able to do STRs because we're currently over the cap.
No, if you got 2,000 units, you're going to be under the cap.
Right, but 2,000 units, but
And that's my concern.
we don't see anything
If
like
these
that
new
on the
developments
horizon.
create the opportunity for an additional 100 units to exist within that census tract, but those new developments don't allow short-term rentals in their developments, then it creates the opportunity for those short-term rentals to happen in the pre-existing neighborhoods, thus exacerbating the issues that our neighbors are dealing with in terms of their quality of life.
Right.
And so that's the concern, because then now you're getting to the point, kind of Shoni was touching on, where, well, you got these, PUDs, and they don't have to deal with these short-term rental issues, but now you've just made it worse in the surrounding neighborhoods.
But is it? I mean,
It
but if you're
becomes
talking about
inequitable.
if you're talking about an additional 100 STR units, you have to have 2,500.
Between
Addition. I mean-
the Sand Docks and Sappy, you're talking about approximately 2,500 units if it all comes to, fruition. But that's what's envisioned as approximately 2,500 units altogether between those two developments.
But right now, you're not going to be able to add that 100 because you're already underwater.
And that's why I said I'm not so concerned about how this is presented because they're finite numbers attached, not just a percentage, not automatic triggers. But I do want to just recognize that as a concern and something for us to be conscientious of, particularly as looking at any future updates to those finite numbers per census tract.
I guess, and I don't, I know enough about this to be dangerous, but if there is development that occurs in Zone 1 or any other zone that ratchets up the number, then, if we're saying the 4% is a good benchmark, then I guess it really shouldn't matter if it adds another 100 units because that's a fraction of the number that the area's increased by. I mean, if we're saying that there's, I don't know how many units are in Zone 1, but if we add another 2,500.
861 housing units in Zone 1.
Okay, so if we add 2,500 units, that's more than double what exists.
Mm-hmm. That's my concern. Is that
But
if we bring on a ton more housing units in this census tract, but they happen to be in PUDs that are not allowing those operations, then it creates those opportunities to increase the concentration much higher than 4% in those other areas of the neighborhood or in the other areas of the census tract, and that's the concern I have. But again, it's not. It's okay with this current version because we have finite numbers here. But yeah,
Mr. Chair.
Yes, sir.
I think we'll have an opportunity to see more of a real world example of what you're talking about, Mayor, in Zone 3 because things are actually under construction.
it's another one to be an eye on. Yep.
We'll be able to, see a real world application of this once those units go online. And it's less speculative, but I do take your point on keeping these things in these developments in the forefront and being intentional about, the impact. But the docks will probably go ahead sooner than anything on Sappy, but a real world application and a real world focus can start right now up through 25, 26 with what's going on with Shaw Walker and Adelaide Point.
Yeah, well, that's a great point with regard to Zone 3 and those developments.
Any more discussion about this, or are we ready to move on in some fashion? I'm glad we had this discussion because I don't think we were in any position to take action after the public hearing. I think this discussion has been helpful for at least for me.
Well, I guess I will. I'm just going to make the motion that was presented, and we can look at amending it as necessary. So I'm just going to, I move the request to amend section 2314 of the zoning ordinance to create a short-term rental ordinance be recommended for approval as presented to the city commission.
We have a motion to have support.
I support.
Motion support. Now let's have further discussion on that motion.
I would, and this is the housekeeping or whatnot, talked about at the very beginning. And so I'm just going to amend that. How do I want to amend that
Exempt from overlay
section
caps.
1C. There's two things we were going to do with that. Sections 1C under exemptions, that the reference to Lakeside Business Improvement District include the Corridor Improvement Authority. So that should reflect Lakeside Business Improvement District / Corridor Improvement Authority boundaries. And in the same amendment, that exemption
From the overlay cap.
are exempt from the overlay cap mentioned in section 1B. Does that track? You follow that, Sarah? You got that? Understood? Does everyone understood what
Yep.
I just, the amendment that I just, okay. So that's my amendment to the motion.
Mr. Chair, there had been requests from staff in section 4A regarding the number of days that would be allowed for the applicant to apply to the inspections department for the short-term rental license. It had been printed as 30. Mike?
Staff's fine with either.
Pardon me?
Staff is fine with either. When we drafted it, we thought
So the current presentation is 60 days. So I guess we should clarify that. What's presented, well,
Oh, sir.
It's 30.
it's 30.
oh, I thought you updated this one as well when you added
Oh,
section
I did
C.
not.
So it's still 30 days. Okay. Well, I'm fine with 30 days. I was going to make another motion to amend and see
Okay.
how that floats with
Okay.
regard to 30
I
days.
just wanted to make sure because it had been brought up.
But yeah, thank you for that clarifying.
So what are you thinking?
No, I've just brought it up. If it was going to be anything, I would want
So we're
a
not-
shorter window.
The amendment does not include changing the time
Not
from
my amendment.
30 days. Okay.
So if there's support for that
Okay.
amendment,
So is that the end of the amendment?
that's the end
Okay.
amendment. I was just doing the housekeeping or cleaning or whatnot for that one
So I have a
section.
motion, do I have a support for the amendment?
They would have to come from Ms. Blake.
Support.
Okay.
I was wondering if y'all.
So we have motion and support for the amendment. Let's not take it as a friendly amendment. Let's take it as amendment. We'll vote on that first, and then we'll vote on the underlying motion to approve the request.
And so I'm just going to read, if I
Yep.
may. The section that was changed is section 1C. So subsection C of the overlay district. And so it would read exemptions. Properties located within the Downtown Development Authority and Lakeside Business Improvement District / Corridor Improvement Authority boundaries are exempt from the cap mentioned in section 1B. Or should I specify overlay district, section 1 overlay district? Okay, section 1B, okay.
Good. Any discussion on that motion? Roll call, please.
Commissioners Blake,
Yes.
Mazade,
Yes.
Seifert,
Yes.
Johnson,
Yes.
and Garum.
Yes.
Okay. So that motion passes. So we'll move on to the underlying motion, which is to approve the request now amended. Is there any further discussion?
I guess I'd just be curious if there's any appetite to going with 3% versus 4%. I mean, I would approve this at 4%. I just.
What'd you say?
I'm just curious if there's any appetite going 3% versus 4%. I mean, I will support 4%, but.
The only reason why I had thought about 3% too is because one of the residents had mentioned it decreases life. I know life expectancy isn't the right word, but you guys get my gist. It can cause deterioration within neighborhoods if you allow too many short-term rentals. And we don't. I'm from the South Heights, so we don't look at that too, like with the red line and everything. We kind of look at it late, but maybe we can think about that now.
I mean, with respect to the district that is already over the cap, I don't know that it makes a whole lot of difference. It may help.
The real world implication here, though, it would be zone 2. So at 4%,
Right.
there'd be opportunity for more short-term rentals in zone 2. With 3%, there would not be any more opportunities currently with short-term rentals in zone
Right.
2. So that's just one
Yep.
real world immediate implication there. And my thought with 3% is that we can always raise it if it's warranted. It's much harder, as we are realizing it's much harder to put the toothpaste back in, in the tube, which is the issue we're dealing with right now with the higher concentrations and transferability issue. And so that's why I'm inclined 3% to start with. But that's
So let's decide what we're going to do with respect to that before we move on with further discussion with the ordinance. Is there an appetite to change the percentage from 4% to something other than 4%?
I had one more question too. Jonathan, when you were saying the Supreme Court ruling, that was at 4%, right?
That wasn't at a percent rate. That was just looking at if they could disallow it in the residential zones. And so that, they found that because it's allowed in another zone, they could disallow it in the residential.
They weren't prohibiting it entirely.
What was it?
They weren't
Correct.
They weren't.
Correct. Yes.
you could now. And so that's that. Had we known that, back in 2019 when we initially adopted short-term rental regulations, the city may have approached this differently, because at that time we were told you cannot ban or exclude short-term rentals in residential areas. That wherever you allow long-term rentals, you must allow short-term rentals. That was our legal understanding at the time. So had the Supreme Court ruled back then, or we had that knowledge base, maybe we would have handled it differently and said, nope, we're not. We're going to make exceptions.
So let's deal with the percentage. Are we interested in changing from the 4% to something other than 4% or not?
Mr. Chair. Mr. Seifert, Mr. Franzik, any observation on a percentage amount do you think would cause a bugaboo?
So
Go ahead.
So the Bowen National Research, who did our housing study, indicated that 5% is when you start to see impacts, negative impacts, and that anecdotally is what we were seeing in the community. So we went with 4% because it was below that. I don't think that we have a strong feeling 4 to 3. I mean, even when we started the discussion, Director Franzik ran the numbers for both of those. So
Yeah, and that's what I was going to say. He did provide that information about what those numbers would look like. So obviously there was some consideration about 3% versus 4%. Okay.
In which case, if we did go with 3%, we'd have to adjust those numbers at the same time.
Okay. All right. So I'm not hearing a motion. I'm not hearing a motion to change that. So we're at the ordinance as presented with the amendment that's been approved. I'm still very concerned about the transferability. Hang on. I think that the comments that have been presented were instructive and useful for me, but I guess I just haven't heard enough reason why we would be so inclined to allow transferability. I mean, if we're under the cap, then that's not an issue, I don't think. But when we're over the cap and we're trying to ratchet that back or get ourselves back into a certain tolerance, then why are we allowing the transferability? I'm hung up on that, I guess. And it seems to be the big issue. It apparently was something that the city staff had considered not allowing, and now for good reason, feel like it should be allowed, but I'm just not there.
So, if I may, just
a
little bit of context. So it wasn't that, and staff can correct me, but it wasn't necessarily that staff was intentional, maybe were, of not allowing transferability. It's just that standard practice, pre-existing standard practice, is that there's no transferability with short-term or long-term rental permits, like, period. Like, you buy a property, they don't transfer, you have to go apply and get your own permit in your own right, which, when there's no cap on how many rentals, it doesn't matter. But when you create a cap, it then creates this tension. And so that's why the commission had the conversation about transferability or not transferability, and someone was like, should it, maybe to an immediate family member, should it just be general? And I'm torn. I understand the desire, particularly in areas of the city where they have higher concentration of short-term rentals, to not allow transferability with the hope that they can get that attrition faster and get it back below that, get it to below whatever the cap is. But at the same time, I struggle with when the city established law and folks made investments in accordance with that law in good faith. And I'm not talking about just the value of the property due to an income. I'm talking about when they have sunk, in some cases, hundreds of thousands of dollars into a property to develop it in accordance with existing law at the time, for the city to then subsequently say, well, nope, you do not have the option to, transfer that, undermining the value of the property that they invested in. So I see both sides, and I can understand the struggle. I definitely, yeah.
Well, I guess my view on that issue is that rules and laws change all the time, and in this case, if we don't allow the transferability, it doesn't change the way anybody is doing business currently. They can continue to do business. It's only upon sale that the issue comes into play. So, it's not uncommon for rules or laws to change.
So, and just a point of clarification, it says that the short-term rental owner, the new owner, can apply for it to be transferred. Doesn't mean it will be transferred. Because the short-term rental, the new short-term rental owner still has to meet all the same requirements.
Okay, but if you do, I mean, what kinds of things would prohibit somebody from, so I buy a property with the understanding or with the desire to transfer that license, assuming that I meet the standards. I mean, would I be denied? Is it likely would be denied?
I mean, you have to go through and meet all the requirements, including, having a property manager or the property owner being within a certain distance of the property for response,
right.
Making sure that, insurance and all that type of thing are taken care of. So, I mean, is it a likelihood that it would not be transferred? Probably not, but especially if it's a savvy owner, but it's not an automatic.
I gotcha. Yeah. But you need to meet the requirements.
Yeah.
To your point about laws changing, they do. Zoning changes periodically, but
That's what it says right now.
prevailing law is that even when you change the zoning, if there's ongoing use pre-existing, then it can be a continuing non-conforming use subsequent to the zoning change. And correct me if I'm wrong, if you are continuing that non-conforming use and you sell it to somebody else subsequently, they can continue that non-conforming use. And so when you factor in the issue of the permitting, it's a roundabout way to say you can't continue your non-conforming use, kind of. And so that's why I'm struggling with, and I don't know, maybe we have heard from legal counsel, Mr. Manager, either Mr. Manager, planning manager, or city manager, in terms of what potential risk or liabilities we open ourselves up to without allowing.
But I don't think in this case, I don't mean, I see both sides of this issue, but I don't see this as a non-conforming use. It is a conforming use. It's something that's allowed. It's just what the city has done is said you can have these short-term rentals. Now we're going to place a cap on them, and that gets back to the issue I brought up quite some time ago in this discussion, was the whole issue about the notion of the cap. And the city's comfortable, city's comfortable with it. The city attorney's comfortable with it. I don't have a problem with it, and I understand the need for it.
Yeah, I was using that as an analogy.
Right,
the non-conforming continuous use.
So I guess I would point out that the first, when we brought this to the LPC meeting, we did not have a transferability in it.
Yes.
So it was, and that was, legal counsel had reviewed at that point. And I'm also skimming the Supreme Court case right now as we're talking about it. So I staff doesn't have a strong feeling on the transferability one way or the other.
What's the LTC?
Our legislative policy.
Sorry.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
So
sorry.
that's how this all started. I brought
Yeah.
this to our LPC meeting in November of 2022. It was actually Jonathan's very first meeting as city manager, and I said, "Hey, city commissioners, do you want to explore new regulations and new zoning and new ordinances for short-term rentals?" And some of these very same folks in this room here were at that meeting in November 2022 as well, weighing in.
I think that the city has done a lot of good things with respect to this issue in terms of spending a lot of time trying to massage it and listening to people. I don't have any issues with that at all. I think you've done a great job, and I think you looked at. It sounds like you looked at what best practices are being used other places. You obviously considered the law governing this issue. So I don't have any issue with the process.
Mr. Chair, I'll just make my position clear at this point. When originally presented, there was no transferability. Transferability issue came up within the commission chambers, I take it, and that's where that came from. I would present this to the city commission for consideration minus transferability. That's where I would support it without the transferability.
Do you want to offer that as a amendment?
Yes.
I'll support that.
So let's make sure we line it up as you did, Mayor, with respect to the other. So what's, I don't have that in front of me. What section? Let's make sure we
That would
modify the ordinance accordingly.
That'd be removing section 4.
Section 4.
So the motion would be to remove section 4 of the proposed ordinance allowing transferring of licenses.
correct.
It would be eliminating that, correct?
Correct.
All right, so we have a motion and a support
I'll support
for
consideration.
amending the ordinance to exclude transferring a license. Discussion on that issue?
I don't think I need to share anything more than I already have on this
No, I
issue.
just- but
It's a conundrum. It is.
Yeah.
It's challenging. I will say that I will support an ordinance that, in either case,
Okay,
with transferability or without transferability.
okay.
I struggle. This is a struggle because in either case it's unfair. It is. In either case it's unfair. It's either unfair to a neighborhood that the number is exceeding the cap, and it's unfair to not allow transferability for the people that have invested, in some cases, their retirement savings into these properties and not be able to recoup their investment. And so in either case, there's unfairness. And so what we are wrestling with, and maybe not so much the Planning Commission, but the City Commission certainly, because we view this differently. We are viewing policy and ordinance and zoning with a different lens than the Planning Commission. And so there are other factors to come into play. And when you talk about, in general, I'm not even talking about investment in short-term rentals, just in general, wanting to welcome and encourage investment in your city, you want to make sure that you're treating them fairly. And that if they have invested in good faith with the prevailing law at the time, that you do not take steps subsequently that undermines that investment. That's where I struggle. That's where I struggle.
I understand.
I understand.
Any other comments?
No.
Roll call, please. So this vote is on the proposed amendment to remove the transferring licenses from this ordinance.
Question,
Yes.
the original motion was not voted on? Or
Not yet. Nope, we're doing that after. Yep, we're dealing with amendments
Okay.
currently.
So, Commissioners Blake,
Yes.
Lizade,
Yes.
Seifert,
Yes.
Gawron,
Yes.
Johnson.
Sorry. I know I'm the final vote that adopts this or doesn't adopt this as an amendment. In either scenario, it's unfair, but I will yield to my constituents. Yes.
Motion passes. And Mayor, it's not lost on me or I think anybody else the difficulty in dealing with these kinds of issues, and I appreciate your thoughtfulness. So the underlying motion is to approve the short-term rental ordinance with the amendments that have been approved, which is the elimination of the transferring license and the definition change to the cap for the Lakeside Corridor District. Right? All right. Any discussion on that motion? Roll call, please.
Commissioners Johnson,
Yes.
Gowron,
Yes.
Seifert,
Yes.
Mazade,
Yes.
Blake.
Yes.
Okay. So the next item is the case number 2024-26, which is the definitions.
This is a staff-initiated request to amend Article 2 of the zoning ordinance to create a definition for short-term rentals. We just passed the ordinance. Now we need a definition in the ordinance. So the proposed definition is a short-term rental, which is a property in which a tenant is allowed to lease the dwelling unit without a host for periods of less than 28 days, but more than 24 hours in return for remuneration. A rental in which the host resides on the premises shall not be considered a short-term rental, but shall register with the city.
Okay. Any questions for Mike? No? Okay, this is a time for a public hearing. If anybody would like to address the planning commission with respect to the definition for the short-term rental, please raise your hand and be recognized and come forward and state your name for the record. Yes, sir.
Bodman. I live in Bluffton. I own several short-term rentals, which I've invested my entire retirement in to provide stays and visitors to this community. And as you proposed moving this to the commission, it has effectively gutted my retirement plan. And there's been a lot of conversations with everyone on this staff and a lot of time put into Jonathan's proposal tonight, and to, with one stroke of a pen, remove transferability.
Sir, I need you to talk about the short-term rental definition. If you want to talk about that, that's the subject we're on right now. So if you want to make comments with respect to that, we'll take comments.
The definition
Yes,
of short-term rentals.
that's what we're talking about now.
Well, I guess I will, I misunderstood that, and I'll just sit down.
That's what the public hearing is for right now.
There's additional public comment at the end.
Yep. Anybody else that would like to speak to this issue with respect to the definition for short-term rentals? Ma'am?
Green Kufta, and I am wondering if you're renting more than 28 days, so you have a guest that would like to stay a month and a half, what would you have a short-term rental do in that respect?
Can you answer that, Mike? I'm not sure I understand exactly.
Would not be a short-term rental. It would fall under the regular rental ordinance.
Yes.
Okay.
So it'd be long-term rental, and the city has an ordinance with respect to that as well.
Okay, so if it's running as a short-term rental and somebody wanted to stay, let's say 30 days, then you'd have to apply for a long-term rental permit for that 30 days?
Standard. You have the standard rental permit. You can't have both. You can only have one or the other.
Oh, you can't have both, okay. All right, so.
So you have to decide what you're
So what
gonna
you're
be.
saying is, yeah, your short-term rentals can't go any longer than 28 days then.
For that definition, but as Mike said, there's also a rental ordinance with respect to long-term rentals.
Right, but you can't do both. Because sometimes guests want to, they may decide that they want to stay for a couple months, and after they've spent, a week here for 3 or 4 years, and they're really loving it. So that's why I had the question.
Yeah.
About that. So that would be my comment, is
Okay,
that
thank you.
it would limit things.
Anybody else? So we'll go to the viewing public. Anybody that would like to address this issue can call 231-724-6721 and give us your comments regarding this issue. Sarah, do we have anybody? So I'll entertain a motion to close this public hearing. So I have a motion and support to close the public hearing. Any discussion on that motion? All's in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Post same sign. Motion carried. So now I'll entertain a motion on this subject matter.
I move that the request to amend Article 2 of the zoning ordinance to create a definition for short-term rentals be recommended for approval as presented to the City Commission.
Have a motion? Do I have support?
Support.
Have a motion and support to recommend approval of the definition for short-term rentals. Any discussion? Mr. Seifert and then Mayor.
Yeah, actually, sorry. The mayor motioned. I apologize.
Yeah, go ahead, Mayor.
And maybe you were about to answer. 'Cause
Yes,
I was doing
going to,
a
yep.
sidebar with you,
Mhm.
so I'll
Okay.
tee up your answer then.
Okay.
To what we heard with regard to someone wishing to rent longer than 28 days, and having that, and whether they're required to do long-term rental or not. What I was kind of doing a sidebar conversation with Mr. Manager here just now is that previously we talked about having that flexibility that if you have a short-term rental permit, that you could rent for longer periods. You could operate as a long-term rental, that you wouldn't necessarily have to get re-inspected and re-permitted. And so I'm just wondering if that is going to be allowed here. And rereading this language here, I think that it would allow it because it just says a property in which a tenant is allowed to lease the dwelling unit without a host for periods of less than 28 days, not only periods of less.
And that's what I was going to say too. And I apologize.
So that may take
Mike.
care of the ladies.
Yeah. So if you want to do it less than 28 days, you're a short-term rental. So then, if that's primarily how you're advertising, that's where you would fall under. But there's nothing to say that you couldn't do it for 45, 50 days, something like that. But if you wanted to do it as a regular short-term rental less than 28 days, that's how you'd have to register. So
Thank you. Thanks for the clarification.
And that is important clarification and recognition that is allowed, because we do see a number of short-term rental properties in which they are, operating on a shorter duration seasonally. Maybe spring to fall. In the winter, they're doing longer-term leases, and so I think it's important that we have that flexibility. So thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Any further discussion on this item? Roll call, please.
Commissioners Blake,
Yes.
Mazade,
Yes.
Seifert,
yes.
Conrad,
Yes?
and Johnson.
Yes.
Motion passes. And Mike, when do these two issues go to the City Commission? I know this is a special meeting, so we're a little off track.
Yep, let me pull up the date. It'll go to the next.
Will it go to the
October-
first meeting in
October
October?
8th, yes.
October 8th.
Okay.
And so,
Yes, sir.
given that our existing moratorium or pause in new short-term rentals expires on October 8th, are we going to have additional language being presented by staff in tandem with consideration of this zoning ordinance to extend that moratorium to coincide with whenever this is formally adopted?
Because
Yes, because
effect.
it may
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
be
After.
unanimous. Everyone may not be there. Plus, you need 10 days after the ordinance passes. So
Staff will have a kind of I don't say ghost, or we'll have a resolution that'll have a blank date, and then that'll be the item under new business after this gets adopted, and then the commission will fill in whether it's 10 days or 24 days, whatever it would be from the date of that meeting.
Okay.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Thank you.
So, yes.
Yeah, is there any new business, Mike?
There's no new business, nope.
Old business?
The Cat Cafe ordinance passed at the last commission meeting, but it does need a second reading.
Okay. Anything from the good of the order from the planning commission? Okay. Not then, we'll take any additional public comments. Sir, did you want to address the planning commission? Yes, this is public participation. Yeah, if you would like to, please come to the podium.
Oh, I'm back. I lost my frame of thought. My name's Ed Bodman. I live in Bluffton. I own several short-term rentals. A lot of work has been done getting to know the city folks, and they're all great people, and they work hard. They try to do the right thing. And for this proposal that Jonathan completed with conversations from so many of us on both sides of the equation here tonight, to be adopted and to remove the transferability part of the equation effectively guts that for many of us who have properties who are unique, properties that we've invested in that were not something that would be a residence at any point in time. To say that we have to sell that as a residence incredibly depletes the value of that property in our neighborhood. Clearly, there are some in Beechwood that are homes that would be sold as homes. But for those of us who have those properties that are on a hill, that are only open 3 months, that are a church, how do you transfer a church into a home, right? So just to strike that down tonight is grossly unfair. And I don't know all of you that are on this planning commission and didn't realize that kind of authority existed in this spot. But a tremendous amount of effort was made to come to what was presented tonight, only to really flip it on its side. And that's really unfair to those of us who have made investments in this community. And those of us who might make investments in the future are going to say, look at what happened here. Why would we do this going forward? This is affecting only 20 houses that change hands each year in that part of our city. You know, the last commission meeting, the commissioner of the Convention and Visitors Bureau was here to express how much revenue is generated because we don't have housing down at the beach. Okay, we do need to get along with neighbors. We need to figure out how to work with them and make it so that we can peacefully coexist. But this doesn't do that. This does the opposite. This effectively takes away 20 to 25% of all short-term rentals by the reduction that's part of what you're saying is over 4% in Bluffton Beechwood. And the thing to maybe do would be to step back and reconsider. You hired a consultant to figure out what should be done with housing here. You did not hire them to assess the short-term rental part of the equation. I've spoke with them directly. And why not spend the effort to figure out this percentage? 4% is a number that was come to based on benchmarks that are national standards. Why not step back and have them do some assessment or work to understand better the impact, certainly to the neighbors, which we hear here regularly, who really are, it's not police reports, it's not compliance issues, it's quality of life, which we don't really have a definition of by standards other than people don't like them. So why not step back and spend the money to find out what we should do, rather than to just throw this to the commission, make it a regulation, and then have so many of us who have dedicated our time and grew up in this community and live in this community to have our time just broken. That's not the fair way to govern. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Hello, Nina Lees, Bluffton Beechwood. First of all, I'd like to say is that transferability was originally never part of the plan anyway. It is not a best practice, and most communities do not offer it. Secondly, in terms of investment in the community, we moved to the community, we put over $200,000 into our house. And all of the neighbors around us have also been putting money in. It's not just the short-term rental people putting the money in. The house is still just as valuable. As you know, I'm a data person, and I've been tracking all of the sales in the last 5 years and watching them, and I've been watching the turnover. I can answer your question about the turnover. I can tell you that 1812 Edgewater has gone through 2 in 4 years in terms of the turnover. The house next to Nancy has now on its 3rd owner in 6 years. I can tell you that the Reberg house, just 2 down from Jack, that has gone through, is now on its 3rd owner. I can tell you 1820 Cherry Street is on its 3rd owner. So even without the transferability, these houses have been becoming, once they're a short-term rental, they have been. Yes, there's been some examples where short-term rentals became individuals. Since the moratorium went in place, in our neighborhood alone, we've had 4 sales. All 4 of them sold way above cost and sold immediately to single home people who have wanted to get into our neighborhood. And we are approached all the time. I'd like to talk real quick. Sure. On the police report thing and the whole, there's this, yes, there's a website that you can do it in. If you look at the stats of our neighborhoods, they are in their 60s and 70s. A lot of them don't even have computers, aren't even familiar with doing it. Dan and I end up being the sounding board for a lot of them. And I can tell you, I have a whole list of things that they've said around things that they didn't report because they didn't want to call 911 and bother. They know that we're short on police staff, and they don't want to bother them for that. The things that we've had tires, we were told, like, okay, go ahead and try to solve it within yourself. We've had tires slashed because someone approached a short-term rental. The next morning they got up, tires are slashed. I know personally of a gun that was pulled on them. Again, people aren't reporting these things, right? People, they've intentionally backed over garbage cans when they were trying to park on the berm, and we asked them to move because they destroyed and damaged our sprinkler systems, and we got it on camera of things. These things aren't reported because it's like, you know what, we love our city, and there's bigger problems that the police need to deal with right now. So I just want to be careful that when you look at those stats, you also have to look at the stats at the same time with the same denominator. You can't say in 3 months I had this many complaints and you put it over the whole year. You have to look at it for what were the complaints in Bluffton Beechwood, what are the normal complaints in that time period, so you have apples to apples and you're getting a fair comparison. Thank you.
All right, thank you. I'll take this gentleman here first. Yes.
Dan Lease, Bleachwood Bluffton. I'm Nina's husband. We've been coming here for 2 years now. The one thing that wasn't talked about tonight was the housing shortage. We're short, I think it's 3,000 homes over 5 years. The homes that sold, I was shocked at the prices the ones went to single-family homes. $384,000 for a 3-bedroom, very small ranch with a detached garage. So these, we paid $100,000, $120,000 for our home. We put $200,000 into it, and it's now worth about $500,000. So the homes in our neighborhood do get gobbled up. And when I look at the prices they're going for significant amounts. So when these short-term rental people turn around and if they have to sell their homes, they're going to be bidding wars. People are going to be waiting for these homes because we're short. Everyone that becomes an STR doubles the problem because it was part of the inventory before you guys started addressing the 3,000 shortage. So you're now short one more when it becomes an STR. We are double what we should be in our area, and we really would like to get down. When we saw, like Nina said, and has been said, when we saw that the numbers were going to go to where they were going to go to, we had hope. There's a lot of them that aren't registered, so our numbers are actually higher. And if the transferability is in there, like Nina said, with Jack and Nancy have been living this dream for 6 years now. They know that those homes will just be turned over. They're turnkey, they come with all the furniture, and they get sold as short-term rentals again. And we've got a lot of examples for that. So I do want to thank you guys for the work you've been doing. I know this is labor intensive, and I appreciate your work. Thank you.
Thank you. One thing that I want to reiterate is the fact that this decision that was made tonight is a recommendation, and it goes to the planning commission, or it goes to the city commission for final consideration. That'll occur on October 8th. Anything else? Yes, I'm sorry, Mr. Page.
Yeah, Jack Page, Beechwood Bluffton neighborhood. As I was sitting and thinking back to the chairman's comment on density, one of the things that I'm seeing in the short-term rental game too is there's a house being developed right behind mine now, was approved for 6 bedrooms, and it has 0 dedicated parking. There is not one curb cut for that house, yet it was approved for a 6-bedroom permit. So they're going to advertise that at Sleeps 12 to Sleeps 14 with only on-street parking to handle that load. So when we are considering these things, that's when the density piece is something you made great point to. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, sir. Here.
My name is Ratan Khatri, and we own a lot of rentals all over Muskegon County. Numbers pretty substantial, but only one of our properties is a short-term rental. And I used to have a couple others over in Norton Shores, but those properties were sold. And we actually had one about 25, 26 years ago on Beach Street, and we owned it for 4 years as a short-term rental before there was Airbnb. And we had parking, we had everything else, and during the summertime it was weekly, and during winter time we rented it out to like college kids or people that were staying locally just for the winter. And the one that we have now that I purchased, it's been 3+ years now. It's on Lakeshore Drive, 1365 Lakeshore Drive, and it was always a 4-unit apartment house. And we have, as this gentleman was speaking, we have put substantial amounts of money into improving this 140-year-old house. And to this date, since I've owned it, I've not had any long-term renters there at all, and I don't plan to. And when this moratorium came about, I was a little disturbed that I didn't know about the registration and everything else. We have the city certificate for rental. We just passed another one just 2 months ago, so the house is in total compliance as a long-term. And there is plenty of parking in the back of this house. And all the neighbors have told me that since we took it over, the property substantially improved because it's no longer a long-term rental. And the guests that we've had over the previous years, none of my neighbors, and I know my neighbors personally, none of the neighbors complained to me or had any issues. And I understand there's some neighborhoods that their density is too great, and I respect that, completely respect that. But the amount of economic impact this business has on the community is, I think, incalculable. I don't think there can be enough studies to show how much money comes into town. And, with the cruise ships coming, with all the conventions, with all the activities, I host a lot of real estate meetups, not conferences, but I bring people in from Grand Rapids. We just had a meeting at Muskegon Brewing Company. We had about 75 people come, and a lot of them were agents and from Grand Rapids area, and they just couldn't believe how beautiful Muskegon is, the lakeshore, the opportunities here, and some level of regulation is good, but I think we can regulate ourselves out of losing a lot of opportunity. And as everybody's mentioned, there's a whole bunch of developments going in between Adelaide Point, Shaw Walker Building, the docks, and it's just going to keep growing. And property values are growing with it, which benefits everybody, I think. And if you're a homeowner, it doesn't impact you because we have the property tax restriction of, 1% a year or something like that. So just because $1 million property goes in next to you, it doesn't mean your taxes are going to go up, because if you're a homestead, it doesn't really affect you.
I need you to wrap up your comments.
But anyway, I'd seriously like to say that other people have made substantial investments, as all homeowners have, in keeping up the properties, and it's in our best interest to make sure that they're run properly, maintained properly, and properly certified. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Nancy Polka. I'd like to thank you for looking at that issue of the transferability. It really makes a huge difference. I understand that it doesn't need to go to the commission. Personally, I've said all along, short-term rentals in commercial districts make sense. If somebody wants to rent out a room in their house, that makes sense. Hopefully a developer will come in here, maybe put more hotels in so that we, like he's saying, that people are bringing money into the city, but they don't have to stay in a short-term rental in a residential neighborhood, taking away our housing stock, taking away, like most of the houses on my street are 1,400 square foot ranch houses with the garage. Those are great family homes. They're great retirement homes, really great for anybody. Why would you want to take that type of housing stock and turn it into a short-term rental when we need people living here, working here, contributing through volunteer work and supporting our schools? We need our residents here. So if we get surrounded by these short-term rentals, or in my case, I never have the hope of the one going away because the one next to me would be so valuable that that license could be transferred. You're going to lose the human capital of people like us who do a lot of volunteer work and really support our community and our schools. I just want to tell you this is history of the house next to me. When I moved in, great neighbors, elderly people, they moved out. People bought it in 2018. She said, I'm working on call at the hospital. I'm just going to stay here when I'm on call. Then they started short-term renting it. Next people moved in, it was going to be their COVID house. They were from Chicago. The other lady was from the Grand Rapids area. Next people come in from Chicago, it's their COVID house. So they stayed there for, a few months, but got some vaccinations. They go back to Chicago, they start short-term renting it. Then last year, they sold it again in the summer. Of course, it's already been a short-term rental. It's advertised that way. As I said, you can sell it with everything in it. They didn't even use a local realtor, so that didn't even keep the money in this community with that commission. Sold right again. People, again, out of town, they come in, they told the neighbors next door, oh, we're just going to have our friends and family stay in here sometimes. And so you're thinking, oh, okay, hopefully that's true. And for a long time, I had a hope that was true. But then you see they're advertising it, and they're doing the short-term rental. So in 6 years, I've had 3 different people in that house. And those last 2 times it turned over, I was really hoping it was going to go back to a single family. And I would again have nice neighbors, like all my other neighbors are wonderful, just as they are throughout the city. But again, it went to short-term rentals. So that's just my story on the house next to me. So if this goes through, like I say, I would never have any hope. And then we're going to have to move. And as you were talking about the property taxes, if I have to go somewhere and buy a comparable house, my property taxes are going to go way up. So it wasn't fair to me when I bought a house in a residential neighborhood, put considerable money in fixing up this house, planning to stay there for the rest of my life. It wasn't fair that I would have to leave because of this. So thank you.
Thank you. Ma'am?
Hi, Pam Westra, and I live here in Muskegon, and I have the business Tiny Digs Lakeshore. It's tiny houses that we developed that whole corner there in Lakeside, and those are not suitable for single-family homes. And I have more questions, I guess, than comments, and I was wondering if anybody could tell me, is it just the one zone that is over the 4% of short-term rentals at this current time?
That's currently the case, right?
Yeah, okay, that's what I was wondering, it's just Beechwood.
That's the far west zone.
Well,
Okay.
Can I qualify that? So that's that one zone when we take out the Lakeside Business Improvement District. If the Lakeside Business Improvement District was included in the census tract, Lakeside would also be over by about 9 units.
Okay, that was my second question.
Yep.
Was, do
But that's
the
currently-
bid zone, corridor zone, do those numbers go into that
The current
formula?
proposal is to.
But those are
pull that.
extracted already from those numbers. Okay, thank you. That answered my second questions. The concept of transferability is a big bugaboo for me, as it was some other people. I just have a question of, if, say, Brunswick or Dick Gezzy or wanted to transfer Gezzy's market, sell Gezzy's market, or Brunswick Bowling wanted to sell Brunswick Bowling to someone else, would they be singled out and said, well, you can't transfer that business to somebody else? These are businesses, as Ed said, as we did. It's a business for us, and we've put life savings into these businesses, and it's not just a $200,000 or $300,000 acquisition. Our development's quite a bit more than that. And would you restrict those other businesses in town and say, oh, you can't do that same business anymore if you sell it, and it's not transferable? That, it just brings a lot of question to my mind in that sense. So, and is there any research that was done in the Beechwood Bluffton area? I think back to Grand Haven and all those houses along the lakeshore there that have been probably rented out for 100 years or more, and same with out here on our lakeshore. How many of those houses that are in that 78 that are in that district have been rentals for a long, long time prior to Airbnb that came about in 2008? I think there's a lot of press and PR about Airbnb and the negativity of it, so then everybody thinks that all short-term rentals are part of Airbnb. And was there any research into those numbers prior to Airbnb? Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else like to address the planning commission? And it doesn't have to be about short-term rentals.
Okay,
Your name again,
Corinne
please?
Kufta. I just have a question. Pamela? She brought a question to mind because I know hers are not residential units. So I just wonder about the it seems like your premise for transferability is so you want people to be able to buy these homes as permanent. But in her case, no one could buy them as permanent. So would there be an exception for something like that?
Well, people do live in tiny homes.
Yeah, but not in, it's kind of like a one little lot. Have you seen her places? Yeah.
Been through every one of
Yeah,
them.
yeah. So I don't think that really fits the picture that you're painting as far as, Bluffton, we want to provide more family homes for people. I don't think a tiny home really. So I just wondered if you'd consider an exception for that kind of thing. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else like to address the planning commission? Mr. Mayor.
Phones, but I do have a couple comments, but we can go to the phones if you want.
Okay, let's do that. Is there anybody in the viewing audience that'd like to address the planning commission on any planning commission topic? Phone number is 231-724-6721. And while we're waiting, why don't you go ahead, Mr. Mayor? You had something you wanted to say.
Yeah, just a couple things. One, in response to what was just discussed, specifically to Tiny Digs, because of Tiny Digs being in the Lakeside Business Improvement District, Corridor Improvement Authority area, there will be no issue. Even though it won't be automatically transferable, any subsequent buyer will be able to apply for a permit. And as long as they meet the city's regulations for operating as a short-term rental, then they'll get a permit. So in that case, there doesn't necessarily need to be an exception. Well, there already is an exception because we're carving out the Lakeside Business Improvement District.
Exactly.
It's just not an exception unique to that particular development or property. But in this case, would be no hindrance to the new owner getting a permit. Also, I just want to, because I've been reflecting further, and I just want to share what my current perspective is on the transferability piece, because I think from the planning and zoning perspective, the right decision was made. When we are looking at through a planning and zoning lens, and we're looking at creating zoning regulations to determine land use and the extent of that land use, then it is important for it to be uniform. And if you create carve-outs or caveats that allow certain area to potentially continuous, long-term, perpetual basis deviate from what we've established as to be the best policy, best ordinance, best practice, it undermines that. So I think from a planning and zoning perspective, the right decision was made. Like I mentioned earlier, the City Commission has a different lens in which we evaluate these things, and I don't think my position will change at the City Commission level, but I do just put a asterisk that I have that latitude at the City Commission.
Yeah, and I think, we know that issues that are decided at the planning commission or recommendations that are made sometimes are changed at the city commission level. And we recognize that is the city commission's prerogative. That's why you make the big bucks. But Sarah, is there any comments? Okay. So if not, is there any other business coming before the planning commission? If not, we're adjourned. Thank you.
You sure?
p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. Conditions around the area at 6 p.m. At Mount Pleasant, it was partly sunny. The temperature was 74 degrees, the dew point 51, and the relative humidity 45%. The wind was south.